You've got a country with over 300 million people that's so polarized, and yet the murder rate is a fraction of what it was in the 90s or the 80s. And the number of actual political killings that takes place in this country is remarkably low, given how polarized everybody's said to be. We're in the immediate aftermath of this. So right now, people are real charged up about it in all kinds of ways. But the thing that I'm always wanting to emphasize, and this goes all the way back to 9/11, today is the anniversary of the September 11th attacks, is that there is a tremendous tendency in the United States, but I think in lots of places, maybe among people in general, to take particular incidents as indicative of trends, even when these incidences are really an exception to what has otherwise been the rule. You know, the rule is generally you can go to a university campus, you can give a talk, and people aren't going to physically attack you. This is something which doesn't fit with that normal rule. So it's very startling, and it makes us go, wow, this isn't a politician. This is just somebody who talks. You and I are people who talk on the internet. We're not nearly as big as Charlie Kirk, but there's some version of reality in which one of us could be in this kind of situation. I've given talks at universities. So there's a possibility of getting frightened by this. Hassan Piker, for instance, is very scared because he was going to engage in a debate with Charlie Kirk, and now he's concerned that he'll be treated as an equivalent figure by other people who might be looking to do some kind of revenge. I think we have to be careful not to allow ourselves to be made afraid by this stuff, and not to allow ourselves to support what tends to happen in the United States when this stuff happens, which is a kind of mad dash to securitize the country. So, you know, if you go to an airport, what is the consequence of the political violence of the September 11th attacks for Americans, leaving aside the Middle East? It's that the airport is this incredibly unpleasant environment now that transgresses against all consumer preferences, miserable, unpleasant, and the airports are constantly changing the rules for whether the laptop comes out of the bag, whether the shoes come off, whether the bag goes directly on the belt or directly in the bin. You're never quite sure what you're supposed to do, and you're always a little bit uncomfortable. And you get through the security line, and by this point, you're exhausted, you're aggravated, you're in a little bit of a mood maybe because of how they've treated you. And then what happens? They cough you out of the security line into a shopping mall, and then they try to get you to buy stuff to feel better about what they've just done to you. And then people end up burning a bunch of money on overpriced crap at the airport. And then, you know, to make the airport look nice, they are continuously refurbishing it. So it's a better and better and glitzier shopping mall. And then this is supposed to make you feel better about what they put you through every time you go through the airport. This is the kind of thing that can happen ultimately to many other parts of our society if we allow ourselves to become frightened and intimidated by these individual acts, whether it's securitizing in response to the crimes of immigrants, or securitizing in response to the crimes of racists, or securitizing in response to terroristic violence, whatever it is. If these acts cause us to make essentializing total claims about where we are at, then we think that we have to have some sort of response. And then that response will enshitify and ruin significant parts of the American environment. You know, they don't ban guns in the United States, but they do make the kids go through metal detectors, and they lock all the doors, and you have to fill out paperwork to enter the building. And you have to put your backpack sometimes through a scanner in some of these high schools. There are parents who won't allow schools in the United States to take their phones away from the kids so that the kids can focus on school, because they want to be able to talk to their kid on the phone in the event that there's a mass shooter that comes into the school. They want their kid to be able to call them, as if that's going to help in any case. And so what do you have? In a lot of US states, you've got schools where the parents have demanded that the kids have their phones with them all the time. So the kids are putzing around on their phones and not learning anything. Now, it ruins, in little ways, so many different areas of life.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with one of my favorite regular guests of the show, Benjamin Studebaker. Needs no introduction other than, political theorist, PhD from Cambridge, author of 2 books, which we've discussed both in previous episodes, Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies and The Chronic Crisis of Liberal Democracy, which had such a big impact on me, I swear, that I had to delay my book by a whole year, basically. I mean, it wasn't the only thing as to why I delayed it, but that was a big part of it. There's a lot to think about in that book, and I'm really glad I did. Thank God I delayed my book. Let's just say that.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. I hadn't heard that was a factor in you delaying the book. That's a big compliment to say that the book was of that kind of influence. Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, by the way, the paperback has been announced for that, and it's going to be under $30 when it comes out. It's going to be really quite cheap by the standards of academic books.
Finally, because a lot of people were like, where do I buy it? It's so expensive because it was under it was a Cambridge University press, so it's just very expensive.
Edinburgh UP.
Oh,
right now
yeah,
the ebook is cheap. The ebook is cheap right now. I understand a lot of people don't want to pay paperback price for an ebook.
Or if you buy an ebook, you could listen to it in audio form, read by one of these British aristocratic narrators in 11 Reader or Speechify, which I honestly love doing. It's sometimes a very fun way to get some reading done. Yeah. Or you can have John Wayne read it. These things are getting really advanced. Like they use AI and stuff, or they can get the cadence right. It's crazy.
It's incredible.
So today we're going to talk about a few things. One, some obvious questions that are really not obvious, like, what is politics? What constitutes political activity? And the question of unions, because I've seen a lot of discourse prop up recently about unions. A certain somebody who won't be mentioned, was getting a lot of discourse, a lot of backlash for making a sort of third worldist argument against unions, saying that, joining a union is actively helping imperialism, and that, it's actually like counter-revolutionary activity. I thought this was interesting because, people are, of course, responding to this by saying, well, Ronald Reagan agrees with you. But there is meaningful discussion to be had about unions today. And I mean, this propped up as early as our first conversation, because in the first book that I read of yours, The Chronic Crisis, there's some real sobering facts about declining union membership, and the fact that a lot of this isn't just class consciousness. There's a real reason why people don't organize. And you talked about it recently with Doug Lane on sublation. So, I mean, first off, I'll start off with a question. How do you see the state of worker organization today? We've known that labor unions have declined, but under Biden, they seem to be making somewhat of a comeback. First off, why did they decline? And also, is there meaningful chance of that coming back?
Yeah, so there are a lot of reasons that the labor unions have declined. And oftentimes when people talk about the problems with the labor unions, they'll mention one of these, but they won't mention them all together. And so the total hopelessness of the picture doesn't come through as strongly as it probably should. So the first reason that the labor unions have declined is that they have become legalized and they've become regulated. So labor unions have a formal legal standing, and on the basis of conforming to the structures laid out in the state regulations regarding what counts as a labor union, how a labor union has to be structured and has to behave to continue to count as a labor union. All of that limits the way labor unions can be procedurally structured, the way they can make decisions, the way they operate and act. So before labor unions were regulated by the state, there was a much broader range of different ways in which labor unions could make decisions or be procedurally structured. Workers could make decisions about how to structure a labor union. And that means that they could customize the procedures to suit the particular context that they were in various ways. Now, because of the corporate law of the state, labor unions have to conform to very specific paradigms and types. And these paradigms and types were written with the owner's involvement to make it difficult for labor unions to make decisions, make it difficult for labor unions to recruit large numbers of other people, or to generate bonds of solidarity across sectors. So this is another thing that I think is very important. The loss of solidarity across sectors. So for instance, in the United States, you can't legally have a solidarity strike. You can't go on strike because somebody in some other industry is on strike and you feel a bond of solidarity with them. That is against the corporate law that regulates the way unions behave in the United States. If you do that, it's a wildcat strike. So it's a strike that's potentially illegal and which could potentially result in your union being no longer recognized as a legal union. So the effect of this is that there's very little in the way of solidarity striking in the United States. So when you go on strike, you tend to be kind of isolated and alone. There's also no habit of workers in different parts of the economy going on solidarity strikes as a consequence of this. So there's no tradition of it for you to tap into or for you to make use of. Now, add to this that over the course of the last 50, 70 years, there's been a huge increase in the percentage of people who go to university, from 5% of the US population in the 40s to almost 40% today. This means that you've got the university culture and the non-university culture operating concurrently. And you have some workers who have university socialization, have been inducted into university language and norms, and other workers who haven't. So one consequence of that is that it's harder to get solidarity between college-educated workers and non-college-educated workers, in part because of cultural differences and language differences. That would be going on even if there wasn't also an attack on the capacity of labor unions to legally engage in solidarity striking, which there was. Now, that's not all. Add to this picture that it used to be the case that when a labor union went on strike, you were typically talking about a union in the manufacturing sector. And if you shut down a factory, even for a brief period of time, say the guys who own the factory, they can get scabs, but it might take them a couple of days to organize up a group of scabs to run the factory. In a couple of days, you can cost the company enormous amounts of money if you shut down a factory. And it takes a long time once a factory in an old 50s, 60s, 70s factory stops working. It often takes a long time to get it going again. So even if you had a brief shutdown for a short period of time, you could cause a lot of damage to the employer. And the damage that you caused to the employer was much greater than the wage loss that the workers might endure over 2 or 3 days of shutdown activity. Now, this has changed in a couple of different ways. For one, there's been a movement away from factories in general toward more service sector-oriented jobs. If you shut down a Starbucks, you do not cost the Starbucks Corporation millions and millions and millions of dollars every day that the Starbucks isn't working. So you don't impose the same kind of cost on the employer that you could with a steel strike or an automobile strike in the 50s or 60s. Now, beyond this, there's also been, over the course of the last 70 years, a big reduction in trade barriers, which means the tariffs, if you move a company overseas to a market where the workers are paid less, where there's less labor regulation and so on, the tariffs no longer exist to offset that difference or prevent you from being exposed to that difference. Now, there have been recent attempts by the Trump administration to muck about with tariffs, but not on the basis of trying to offset wage differences or standard of living differences between, say, the United States and China. And not only has the trade barriers been reduced, but also there have been major developments in industrial engineering that have made it much easier and cheaper to pick up and move a factory from one place to another place. So now, if you cause a disturbance that costs the company millions of dollars by shutting down a factory, other parts of the economy do not come to your defense. You don't have a bunch of other parts of the economy joining you in solidarity. And the way the company is likely to respond is to go, okay, we can't be losing millions of dollars in this kind of way. So we're going to pick the factory up and move it to a country in East Asia where the wages are really low, the labor protections are really low, and the state will help us to subdue anybody who tries to cause any trouble. So this is what now typically happens. If you do get radicals in a union who want that union to do something more muscular, the typical response is that the jobs will just move away. They'll go somewhere else. That wasn't the case in the 50s and 60s. In the 50s and 60s, there were not very many other places that you could move where you wouldn't face major trade barriers that would make it extremely difficult to operate. And this is why in the 50s and 60s, there was all this complaining as gradually the German economy developed and Germany became a major competitor, and the Japanese economy developed and Japan became a major competitor. And you had Americans, especially in the automobile industry, complaining about imported cars from former Axis powers. And all of this prefigured China coming into the discussion and becoming a major flashpoint. This gradual opening up of the economy over the course of the post-war era, which was done through the GATT trade rounds, and then eventually in the 90s, the creation of the WTO. There were multiple, seven or eight different rounds of GATT over the course of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. What this did is it completely transformed the balance of power between capital and labor, completely, to the point where even though the labor union membership was going up in the 50s and 60s and peaked in the 70s in the United States, the actual de facto power of labor unions decreased over the course of that 30-year period, even as the union membership rates went up. And so as a consequence of all of this, and I haven't even gotten into things like right to work legislation, which makes it difficult for unions to extract dues from their members so they can't build up strike funds. I mean, there's all sorts of little things that people devote a lot of attention to that only make this slightly worse relative to the major structural factors I'm highlighting here. The effect of all of this is that the unions and the people who work in these industries have discovered that if they listen to the radicals who tell them that they should go on strike, what will happen is that they'll be crushed and their jobs will disappear. And so therefore, they have tended to acquiesce in the transformation of the unions into administrative management systems for keeping the workers in line. And it's still the case that being in a union typically makes you marginally better off than not being in a union. Still the case. And it's still the case that, if you have an opportunity as a teacher to join a public sector union in a state that permits that in the United States, you're going to be better off in that than not in that. But the possibility of using labor unions to generate a trade union consciousness that you could then transform into some kind of revolutionary consciousness, the possibility of showing workers through their trade union activity that they have the ability to confront capital and win, this has receded massively over the course of the last 70 years. Massively. And it's not something that can be fixed by Joe Biden's Protect the Right to Organize Act, which ultimately he promised to pass but never passed. That act was never passed by the Biden administration. And if you look at the percentage of Americans in labor unions, it has not gone up, even though there are all these reports and left-wing magazines and love to talk about labor organizing efforts because it gives people a sense of hope. If you look statistically, there's been no increase in the percentage of the US population that's unionized. And in the 70s, when the percentage was several times higher, the level of industrial engineering, while advanced relative to the 40s, was not advanced as far as it is today. Those workers in the 70s who had much more of a tradition and habit of going on strike and of trying to use the leverage and power that they had were completely steamrolled over the course of the 70s and 80s. It's not that the workers are low consciousness and they're just stupid and don't know their own strength. It's that people tried things in the late 70s and through the 80s that were completely unsuccessful. And they were shocked to discover that their jobs would actually disappear and go to Asia, or that in some cases, the government would just fire enormous numbers of people, like the air traffic controllers in the 80s. a lot of this stuff young people aren't aware of, just haven't heard about, haven't read about. Labor history is not something that is talked about very much. And there are a lot of people who have a kind of grift going where they generate false hope in various left-wing strategies that have failed repeatedly over time. So these people don't draw attention to the history of failure, and they make various kinds of excuses for it. But each of these excuses that is made might, to some degree, ameliorate one of the many different things I've just mentioned, but they're certainly not going to deal with all of them as an interconnected nexus.
This is perhaps the most serious limitation of left-wing politics right now. I think it's the most serious obstacle, like real obstacle, in the sense that it's one that I genuinely do not have the answers to, and I think it might even pose serious problem for, I wouldn't say class politics entirely, but the type of class politics that we might envision, which is, largely driven by the working class, because it poses a problem for all flanks of the left. It's not like this is just a sectarian thing. Because, I mean, you look at social democrats who would want, a radical form of social democracy or a democratic road to socialism, even somehow. But usually the democratic socialists more are aware that you need a labor movement or some kind of power block to like make this happen, because you can't just rely on the operating solely with the powers that be. You need power outside of that. But the basis for that power block, as you just articulated, is very much diminished. And even though Trump, alludes to like wanting to bring back deindustrialization through these tariffs, and that's certainly what Bannon in the kind of that wing likes to make it seem like is going to happen. But as you talked about in a previous episode, the real effect of these tariffs are much more geopolitical, in that it's kind of trying to pivot the world away from China and largely weaken China, as opposed to this idea that America is nuking itself because it somehow wants to bring back jobs, which is the kind of popular conception of these tariffs. So this suggests limits for social democracy, but it also suggests limits for all the other things, because, ultra leftists, whether they're, libertarian, socialist, anarchist, or Marxist leaning, will sometimes say, well, you don't want trade union consciousness, but you want to organize the workers politically for a revolutionary strategy. But if they lack the power to even organize economically, why would they have the power to organize, politically in that way? Because the basis of their political power, I mean, if you take at least the Marxist understanding, why did he choose the proletariat? The proletariat wasn't because they were, better morally or something. It was because like there was other oppressed classes Marx could have picked as the revolutionary subjects of history. He could have picked the peasants. He could have picked women. He could have picked slaves. He could have picked the lumpen proletariat, Could have picked the unemployed. He could have picked the petite bourgeoisie. But he thought the workers had the most power and the most interests, because while the other groups might have had the interests, at least the other underclasses, they don't have the power. Like peasants are kind of, scattered across various rural areas. Like they don't have this ability to engage in solidaristic action in the way that people compressed in urban factories or just in compact areas can work together to sort of shut down production and hold the economy hostage.
Yeah,
if you have that,
the proletariat for moral reasons. He picked the proletariat because there seemed to him at that time to be good reason to think that the proletariat actually had the capacity to make the revolution.
Exactly. So if the proletariat now seems to be increasingly lacking that power that, Marxists once thought it had, what does that say for the direction of class politics? Because I still see to this day, Marxist dogmas will reject any kind of attempt to reach across class lines as like, petty bourgeois consciousness. Like in Canada, a lot of people dismissed the trucker convoy, a lot of Marxists, because it was petite bourgeois and not working class. And I think At least in Canada, because I'm more familiar, I guess, with the conditions. I'm familiar with the U.S., but not as much. And it's also so much more diverse in America that it's really hard to
Different
sometimes
states have
assess.
different rules.
Yeah. That in Canada, I thought like the only basis for any kind of like even social democratic politics, let alone revolutionary politics, is a sort of at least alliance between, parts of the PMC, parts of the petite bourgeoisie, and parts of the working class. Because the petite bourgeoisie, small business owners still have like a degree of power, right? They still have that power. And also PMC, I would say some don't, but some do. I mean, I've noticed even Yanis Varoufakis flirt with ideas of like trying to about like, the tech workers, because the tech workers hold immense power. What I'm kind of saying here is we have to get kind of like realist about what is the power block of political coalitions. This idea of just like the working class. It's just as phantasmatic today as the idea of what the kind of post-Marxist new left wanted to do, which is organize students and oppressed minorities who don't really have a material basis of their solidarity other than their common oppression.
Right. The New
And that's
Left
failed
went looking for
spectacularly.
a different revolutionary subject. And the New Left also threw a lot of hope into the idea that the administration of society would produce a new kind of subject, that you could expand the university system to the point at which it included everybody and produce a universal kind of administered subject who nonetheless might come to have a revolutionary attitude. If you look at a book like Jürgen Habermas's Legitimation Crisis, this is premised on this kind of thinking, that there was going to be a rapid transformation technologically of society and a rapid spreading of tertiary education to huge parts of the population. What has instead happened is that there's been a much slower process of change that has produced fracturing, where there's parts of society and parts of the world at radically different levels of technological development and educational development. So there has not been the production of some universal new subject who's revolutionary in some different way from the old proletariat. Rather, what we've got is some old industrial workers, some people who are still in the Teamsters Union, in the Railroad Union, in unions that at first glance would seem to be like the old kinds of unions belonging to the old kind of socialism. And then at the same time, other parts of the population in the gig economy, in the service sector, in sectors that are very difficult to organize or to effectively unionize, with enormous amounts of international trade continuously altering the way any particular country functions within this system. So if any country tries to, in any particular territorial area, get control over this and try to manipulate its internal structure to produce a different outcome, that structure then changes rapidly in response to that attempt, such that the attempt then comes to not match the structure that's there. So this has just made things enormously complicated. And the search for some other single model of what capitalism is, or what some kind of post-capitalism is, whether it's the language that some people use of neo-feudalism or what have you, the search for something in particular that you can simply grasp and organize, that has really borne very little fruit. And so, of course, there's a continuous desire to come back to a model which makes more sense and is easier to pick up and use. And that old model of proletarian socialism has some track record of seeming success because it produced the Russian Revolution, produced attempted revolutions that seemed to come close to succeeding in places like Germany or Italy or Spain. So there is this appearance of some viability there, but it belongs to a particular configuration that has since been heavily transformed by administration and by international trade and by technological change.
And you're right, already there, just those examples, we could even argue that like none of those were really even proletarian. Like at least the Russian Revolution wasn't really like proletarian revolution fully. Like, I mean, it's mostly peasant worker alliance and military coup in large part. Like at least the Bolshevik takeover, there's the most anti-war party. You could get the most soldiers on that basis, right?
There was a need to cooperate with the peasants in these contexts. And of course, the peasants, that's the class that is most straightforwardly liquidated today, because rural work is almost totally automated. If you have large numbers of people engaging in rural labor, you have a very backward agricultural sector these days. That's why the populations, if you look at a map of the United States and you look at what's the peak population of the different counties, there are counties in Nebraska and the Dakotas where the peak population was in 1890, because there's no need for any substantial number of farm laborers in the Great Plains states anymore.
So with this decline of labor power, where that's also important is because, it creates a huge limitation for just organizing workers. But the other thing is you can't just assume that now extra parliamentary politics or revolutionary politics is any more possible, because the general strike, right, is just as impossible under this scenario. And then you have the Marxist Leninists, or just Leninist adjacent, because that includes the Trotskyists, who will say, okay, well, you don't want to be stuck in trade union consciousness anyway, so you have a vanguard. But a vanguard without a strong working class that it's supposed to be ostensibly representing, I mean, what's that going to do? So
yeah, the relationship between the intellectuals and the labor movement can't operate in accordance with the theory if there is no functioning labor movement.
And I think because there's this utter powerlessness that we're seeing with the basis of left-wing politics, or that a lot of people squabble with each other for that power. So parties compete with each other, they steal stuff. You have these new parties splitting off, trying to steal people from the DSA or from just other micro sects. It's really bleak, but okay, one, is there any possibility this could you mentioned Roosevelt, and you mentioned you didn't say Roosevelt by name, but what a lot of these changes took place during the New Deal, when you had simultaneously an ability to organize, but also tightly regulated by the government, and especially after with Truman and a bunch of laws gradually in different states, right to work laws, Taft-Hartley, having state-sanctioned unions like the AFL-CIO, AFL-CIA, some people call it, right? This attempt to tightly control unions and also make it so that you have workers get paid but also have no solidarity in the way to seriously pose power and also pose political visions, because that's part of the anti-communist sort of crackdown. How do you reverse that? I mean, so the idea of building a labor movement first and then having a political change seems kind of impossible. But what about the idea of having a political movement first that can lead to undoing laws like that, to change, to make it easier for the labor movement, which could, make this more possible, which is sort of what I think a lot of the people at Jacobin, for example, kind of envision with Corbynism or Sanders. And I wonder if that is at all possible, and if not, what is the kind of alternative there? Because
a lot of people focus in on the administration of the unions and go, if only we could reverse the administration of the unions, then that might be enough. But in focusing on the administration of the unions, the international trade and technology parts are swept under the rug and not paid too much attention to. To be able to create wildcat unions or less regulated unions, or unions that are empowered by some new state policy to be stronger or tougher in some way, would have to be the case that that's compatible with having a competitive economy able to compete for investment in global capitalism. And the problem that states keep having is that if you make these kinds of concessions, then you have workers who are too expensive to attract investment, and you have technological problems as well. So, for instance, recently there was a strike in the United States by the dock workers, and concessions were made financially to the dock workers. But the employers said, now that we've made these concessions, we're going to technologically modernize the docks so that we don't have to have nearly as many dock workers hired. If they're going to raise wages, then they're going to find a way to automate more of it so that the docks are still competitive, so that you're not operating at a great loss relative to if you stick your money in other parts of the world. This element of this, the level of international trade, the huge amount of it that now goes on at very low tariff rates, the ease with which people can move money all over the world, no capital controls, no nothing. This is not properly appreciated. And then, of course, also the technological change, which has made it just physically easier to move even physical capital, even operations that used to be extremely expensive to move, that used to be cost prohibitive to relocate. Economic geography, the study of how locations and places contribute to making something low cost or cost effective. If you make it easier for stuff to be modular and to be moved from place to place, then economic geography confers reduced advantages. And then that makes it easier to respond to a disruption in the cost in a particular place with movement. So this capital mobility, is my quick way of referring to it in my work, this capital mobility that's increased dramatically has really, and which is aided by technological development that facilitates the movement. We're not just talking about money here, we're also talking about physical capital of operations from place to place. This is not something that can be tackled from a single national point of view. And so there is a kind of nationalist preoccupation with trying to actualize powers that nation states are said to have, but which those nation states could not possess in this kind of integrated global economy that we have with this level of technological development. The time period in which nation states could plausibly rearrange their internal economy without having to worry about the reaction of international markets, was a period when there was much less trade, the era of the world wars, the era of very high tariff rates. This is a world that existed not in the post-war era so much, because in the post-war era, this world was gradually being unwound as the GATT trade rounds were opening it up. We're really talking about the world of the 30s and 40s that people are nostalgic for, when you had much less international trade, much higher trade barriers, and therefore countries were able to reorganize themselves internally very heavily without any serious international market reaction.
And that implies that the way to actually, to make this happen, you kind of need to restructure global trade. And I wonder, one, if that's already kind of happening, that's kind of already, you could say maybe there is a retreat from free trade gradually, because as people become dissatisfied with capitalism and the left can't win, but there is a kind of yearning to do something, the right-wing parties, populist parties, are more likely to kind of let the international capitalist, they're more likely to throw them under the bus than the national capitalists, generally speaking. So they might, if you get more countries doing sort of like isolationist policies that turning inwards, I mean, in some ways it sounds like a bad thing just from the standpoint of like, if Europe goes that way, that might not be good given the history of Europe. But could that like leave space for, if there's like less capital mobility, could that allow more opportunity to actually do changes at a national level? Or if we're, political movements are to work with the international system, because in order to make things happen, you need other countries by your side, and you need more. That you can't just work on its own. I mean, socialism by itself is proof of this just alone, right? Like, you need other countries to be in support, which involves a kind of internationalist politics. But the limitation of internationalist politics is, I think, that it actually doesn't resonate very well. It's usually too vague, this idea of like, it ends up being manifest in this sort of like rootless cosmopolitanism that has backfired very hard, where like in Italy, the kind of anti-nationalist position of the communists made it very easy for them to be accused of being Soviet collaborators. And that's kind of what happened, honestly. I mean, a lot of communist parties ended up being controlled by the Comintern, by having like taking their orders and stuff. And then what it was, a Comintern Soviet mouthpiece, was geopolitical tool more than spreading communism, really. So like, but so how do you do internationalism that doesn't make people look at you like, okay, well, because J.D. Vance made this comment, right, where he was critiquing a straw man of leftist internationalism, and it's a point a lot of people critique, but it's a point that is very old, and I mean it has staying power, which is, people who claim to care about the whole world and have like internationalist politics as opposed to nationalist politics, they really don't care about anybody, because it's easy to care about everybody because you can't actually do anything, to like have an impact on that. Whereas stuff that's in your immediate area, your locality, your nation, is stuff that involves you as a citizen, and that where stuff you can actually like make a change. So this is a long-winded way of saying that internationalist politics really doesn't resonate with a lot of people, but there's a need for internationalist politics at the kind of cooperative, practical level in terms of action.
Yeah, because
So
what does
where do you go
internationalism
from here?
mean to people now?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean the revolution. The Leninists, for them, internationalism meant a revolution that was going to spread to every part of the world, a revolution that necessarily had to occur in multiple different European countries at once or in very near proximity. What does internationalism mean now? It means fealty to the post-war international system, to the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, the WTO, all of the organizations which are responsible for subjecting everybody in the world to capital mobility that debases and degrades their capacity to organize and have meaningful influence over their day-to-day lives. So internationalism now is not only associated with a kind of humanism, it's associated with a kind of anti-humanism, because it's associated with an impersonal technocratic apparatus which seems to continuously weaken your own ability to control anything in your life. So there's now enormous opposition to internationalism and a demand that everything that be done to change the world occur through nation-state institutions, national democracy. Well, what happens if you try to work through nation-state institutions? All the nation-states, because they are all sovereign and they all get to make their own little rules, they all have their elections on their own little timetables, which means you get elected in one country, you want to do something. You have to wait for people in other countries to also be elected who want to do the thing. By the time they get elected, the people in your country are bored and annoyed with you for doing nothing. So they vote you out. And at any given time, the number of governments with a shared understanding of what's going on and of what to do about it is never very large. So what happens is that multilateral approaches repeatedly fail because people wait for democratic elections to occur in nation states, and those democratic elections never produce the kind of coordinating capacity necessary to make large-scale change to the international system. The only remaining option then is states to unilaterally attempt to break away or to violate the rules, which is what the Trump administration is presently attempting to do. The Trump administration locked up the WTO by refusing to appoint anybody to the appellate body, caused all of the WTO appellate body members to have their terms expire, and then the appellate body fell in 2019 below 3 members, so it could no longer function, which means if you have a dispute about a trade agreement, you can't take it to the WTO appellate body anymore. There is an interim process that the EU initiated that some states have signed up to, but many, many states, including a lot of states in Africa and in Asia, and the United States, of course, have chosen not to join. So now it's very difficult to adjudicate trade disputes, which makes the whole WTO system less stable. What does that mean in practice, though? It means that the states that are the most powerful and have the most distinctive advantages, so rich countries with a lot of consumption per capita, like the United States, they are able to push countries into bilateral agreements But the smaller countries, which have much less leverage and are in a more competitive environment with lots of other countries that are broadly similar to themselves, have the same kind of consumption capacity, the same kind of production capacity, countries that are more interchangeable in terms of the roles they can play in the international system. These countries are still trying to maintain the rules-based order because they don't anticipate that they can obtain large advantages through bilateral bargaining. Only the United States thinks that it's in a sufficiently strong position to use bilateral bargaining as a tool. Even China is a member of the multi-party interim process. So even China believes that it's best off staying within the WTO rules and being a party to appellate body decision. It's only the United States that chose to sabotage the thing outright. So now we have this question of, can the United States change the rules for itself to give itself some kind of advantage? But it's not looking to change the overall rules of the system. The Trump administration is not leading some kind of credible WTO reform effort or trying to structure some alternative rules-based system to the WTO. Rather, it's just breaking the rules and saying, you guys can go follow the rules if you want in the multi-party interim arrangement. But we aren't going to follow the rules. And if you want to trade with us and you want access to our large consumer market, you have to make some kind of bilateral deal with us. So the United States has broken the rules and damaged the system by doing that, but it's not in a strong enough position to produce the level of coordination necessary to make new rules or to replace the WTO system with an alternative system. And that was highlighted in the failure of the Doha round, the latest round of trade negotiations, which began in 2001, which ended in ignominious failure in 2008. In that case, the United States was trying to get that Doha round negotiated in a particular way. India was resistant to some of the American proposals, and the United States was resistant to some of India's proposals. There was a big lockup in 2008 over agricultural subsidies, and the talks collapsed. The United States wasn't able to make all of the countries agree to its new version of the rules. It had to accept that it wasn't going to be able to do that. And then it became increasingly discontented as the appellate body issued decisions in the early 10s that worked against US interests to some degree. And it was in that context that Barack Obama began refusing to reappoint people to second terms on the appellate body. First, it was an American that he refused to appoint to a second term. Then it was an allied state representative, a South Korean, that he blocked the reappointment of. And then Trump locked the whole thing up, and Biden continued the policy of locking the whole thing up. It's a bipartisan effort to lock up WTO, not just a Republican. All of this has produced a context in which the United States is trying to get special treatment, but it's not trying to change the rules or make a new system. And that, I think, is really key. Looking for special treatment and looking for special arrangements, that's something that you can do if you're a country that's more powerful than the other countries, but not powerful enough to dictate the structure of the system.
The people in Europe seem to be, like the left-wing movements in Europe, seem to be a little more aware of this than Americans and Canadians. And that a big discussion around Diem is like, how do you reform the EU, or do you like propose a new EU or something like that? Because clearly to get anything done, you need some kind of international effort, which is, I think at the level of like European kind of unity makes sense. It's a little harder to do that with nations that like the United States or Canada. I mean, Canada, the closest attempt to do this was the CCF wanted to do what was part of the new Commonwealth. Like, the idea of the creation of the socialist new Commonwealth. And it was something that had as a shared solidarity with the Labour Party in its more radical era and of both Australia and England. At least there's a kind of basis of cultural similarity there and a basis for cooperation. What I don't see on the one hand what I see lacking on the left today is one, political strategies that are internationalists that actually have a basis for that, other than this kind of vague Marxist internationalism, which I think is futile, but like a kind of ideological basis for internationalism that actually can kind of stick, because there's this kind of anti-Westernism on the left. And I feel like at the very least, if not a kind of culturally grounded vision, you do need something that is Western about your view. But what I see is kind of fetishization of Eastern ideologies. I mean, Lash noted this very early on in Agony of the American Left, one of his early books, but it's, I think, actually a lot worse now in this kind of more nihilistic time, where a lot of people will import like ideas from the East, or, they'll say, what's an example of like success that you want? They either say China if they're Marxist Leninists, or they say Norway if you're, a social democrat, but both are very different systems, not really tailored to
And they're both part of the global system. They're both WTO member states. They're both members of the multi-party interim arrangement. They are committed to the international institutions. This is not the Cold War. The Soviet Union was not in the WTO. Czechoslovakia had its GATT membership suspended because it adopted a socialist system. In the old days, if you had a different kind of regime, you were out of the Western system. The different kinds of regimes that exist now are all compatible with membership in the international institutions. They're all compatible with following the rules-based international system. These countries are all submitting to some kind of arrangement. So there's this nationalist fantasy that China is something fundamentally different and distinct. Its growth is completely tied to Richard Nixon opening China to the United States, and then the decision that was made by George W. Bush to include China in the WTO in 2001. The decisions to incorporate China into the system, even though China was not a liberal democracy, to give China special treatment on the grounds that it was a big state and that by splitting it off from the Soviet Union, you could greatly shrink the potential of the Soviet bloc. Those decisions have caused China to become integrated into the international system. So it's not as if China offers some alternative system like the Soviet Union once did, and that countries can choose to be part of instead of the Western institutions. There's no Chinese alternative to the IMF, the WTO, the World Bank. Indeed, China has gotten rich insofar as it has gotten rich by participating in those institutions and by cooperating with the rules. So what we're really talking about here is that there's a set of people who think that because the proletariat has increasingly moved to Asia, because a lot of production was offshored to Asia in response to the labor organizing that did take place in the rich states, and in response to the increased mobility of capital, thanks to the lowering of the trade barriers and the increase in industrial technology, they think, okay, maybe the thing to do is to organize the workers in the places where the industry has moved. Of course, the industry can move again. And what do these countries in Asia do? They keep their wages very low relative to what they produce so that they don't have an exodus of these companies and these industries to other, even poorer states in places like sub-Saharan Africa. So even a country like Japan has a final consumption per capita that's much lower than you would expect, given how wealthy Japan is and how much Japan produces. Because since Japan developed by siphoning production from the West, Japan has to maintain a competitive advantage on that production. It has to keep its cost low to keep that business in Japan. Otherwise, the Japanese companies will, and sometimes they do this, open factories in the United States again, open factories in other parts of the world where they anticipate that they can get a labor deal that's just as good, if not better, and maybe circumvent tariffs in a country that's attempting to tariff Japanese companies. So what you have to deal with here is that there is no two systems anymore. There's a nostalgia for the Cold War and a nostalgia for a possibility of a second system. And so people keep trying to hyperstition this into being. But this overlooks the way China actually did get rich and actually did develop insofar as it has. And while Japan has I think a final household consumption per capita that's under 30 grand compared to the American, which is over 50, if you're looking at the whole household as opposed to particular individuals. China has a final consumption per capita household figure under $10,000, which means that China really cannot consume on a per capita level the kinds of things that can be consumed in other parts of the world, which means China cannot overnight come to play the consumptive role that the United States especially, and to a lesser extent, the rich allied Western states play. And when you have an integrated global trade system in which all of the countries are playing a different role in a global system, in one system, a post-Cold War, post-Soviet, Fukuyama-ist, no alternative system, every country's got its role to play. It's not so simple as to say, I'm on this side or I'm on that side. I like this country. I like that country. These countries don't have different, separate, distinct models. They're all interdependent. And each of the models, insofar as it's been successful, has been successful as a consequence of its interaction with the other models that you may not like. Who does Norway sell its oil to? Countries that don't have models like Norway. Who does China produce goods for? Countries that don't have models like the Chinese model. But people want it to be the case very badly that there are different choices out there in the world, different countries with different systems, and they can be fans of this one or that one, or put this flag or that flag in their profile. Mm-hmm. It's not how it works anymore, unfortunately for these people. But there's deep denial about it. And because no one's engaging in any kind of meaningful political activity, there's no consequences to indulging in nationalist fantasies. Nothing bad is going to happen to you because you're not going to accomplish anything with this. It just becomes a way of fobbing yourself off and giving yourself an aesthetic that might make you seem cool with your friends, which is what a lot of this stuff is really about. It's really about getting the approval of your friends who think you're smart or cool or edgy.
BRICS, even like internationalist fantasies. Like BRICS is kind of a new internationalist fantasy that's supposed to be alternative from the US. We've already kind of discussed that in
the collapse of the actual percentage. I think they peaked at 2.5% of all global reserves being the Chinese currency, and that was several years ago. And now they're well beneath that 2.5% figure. I think maybe half of that figure now, something like that. Countries that produce or that extract oil and gas, these are not the countries that can be the reserve currency in a system where there is a scarcity of high consumptive states and an enormous array of states that would love to manufacture and would love to be the recipients of some Lego kit factory that comes and moves to one of their coastal ports.
Indeed. So the reason I brought that up, okay, is because what you have right now is a substitute for politics. It's kind of, I think, cover for nihilism, is this sort of third world fetishization, this idea that there's like other systems we can whatever. But the point is because how do we actually come up with a politics when there's economic conditions that make what was supposed to be the determinist view of politics, the Marxist view of which the working class in its own interest will rise up or whatever, when the economic conditions make that vision of politics seemingly impossible, how do you have a politics? And, I think this is a good time to like get into what actually is politics. I know, it's not a very obvious question. I want to see how you kind of square the role of politics with unionization and these kind of economic forms of organization. Because I see politics as sort of an intervention into history. It doesn't always work. In fact, it often doesn't. But I view politics as like an intervention. So when you have conditions that, might not make this like economic view of like, the idea you just have the workers or whatever, you're gonna need to come up with something else. And that act of coming up with something else, I view as a very distinctly political act. While you can say our political change is inevitable, I believe there is like a certain kind of zeitgeist, they use the Hegelian term, like a world spirit, which is constituted by general conditions that are happening, real conditions. Political changes don't necessarily happen because of this zeitgeist. Political changes sometimes happen due to interventions into history, but these interventions into history aren't like outside of that zeitgeist. Interventions into history kind of embody parts of the zeitgeist. It's kind of like how Hegel saw Napoleon, for example, is he saw Napoleon as like embodying a part of the zeitgeist, which is an acceptance of parts of the Enlightenment, but at the same time, a walking back on the excesses of the revolution. What I'm kind of alluding to here is, because I'm going to put forth my view, and then I want you to put forth yours, is politics, when the seeming way things are heading aren't working, you need to kind of groups, okay? Obviously not, I don't believe in the great man theory, but I do believe in group theory of history. I do believe groups change history. But groups don't change history outside of it. They have to kind of adapt to the zeitgeist, to the conditions, which means that you need a politics. It's an intervention, but one that's kind of like suitable to the ideological zeitgeist, the ideological conditions, and the real world economic conditions, which are never completely separatable. So that's why I brought up the kind of Western socialism thing, because you can't just like copy old strategies like the kind of just labor unions, the road to social democracy. You can't just copy Marxist-Leninist forms that worked in the East. So you need a kind of intervention. And what does that look like? What does that mean? I know these are all huge questions, and I'm probably articulating it very poorly, but yeah, what is the role of
there's
politics
a
in all
lot that's
this?
interesting in this. So the way that I think about politics is it's a capacity to take decisions on matters about which there's intractable disagreement. So to take a decision on a matter about which there's intractable disagreement, you still are working with the people that you're disagreeing. They're parties to the decision. They might have to participate in the decision to carry it out, or at the very least, they have to accept the decision and accept themselves as subject to it. So they have to not interfere or prevent the decision. So to actually take a decision, you need other people to cooperate with what's been decided. And you need the people who are not actively cooperating to at least not get in the way to the point at which it's impossible for the action to take place. This is a different conception of politics from ones that some people may be familiar with in the political theory literature. So for somebody like Carl Schmitt, politics is about deciding who's a friend and who's an enemy. So politics is about excluding some people from the category of friends, making them enemies, and then potentially doing violence to them on the basis of their enemy status. For me, politics is not something you do to enemies. Politics is something you do with people with whom you disagree. So it involves cooperating with people with whom you're holding a contradiction. Not going, I can't cooperate with you because there's a contradiction, you're an enemy. That would be to treat them as a hostis, as a stranger, or as an enemy in a war, not as a fellow citizen with whom you have a deep disagreement. Conversely, it's also not what Hannah Arendt is talking about. Hannah Arendt talks about acting in concert, something where people come together and all through a speech act come to the same view about what kind of action needs to happen, what kind of action needs to take place.
That's like the Habermas view,
kind of
right?
deliberative
action.
Yeah, deliberative modes often overemphasize the degree to which you can produce consensus or agreement. Politics is not something you do with people that you agree with. It's something you do with people with whom there's disagreement, but nonetheless, a recognized need for a decision. And to have a political capacity, therefore, involves recognizing that you have intractable disagreement, that you're not going to be able to dissolve it, but that you nonetheless need to work with these people. So you can't make them enemies, nor can you make them parties to a strong consensus with you. Secondly, you have to make a decision. You can't delay and not act. You've got to do something. And then third, you've got to be able to acknowledge when you make the decision that you're going to be coercing these people because they're not all going to be agreeing with you. And they have to be able to bear that coercion, even if they resent it or they find it annoying or they feel alienated from the decision as a consequence of it. they have to bear the coercion. So they have to do what it is that you're demanding that they do, or they have to at least get out of the way of it. So these are a bunch of different things that people need to be able to do to be able to act. And of course, if you want to act on a very big scale on something like the international trade system, you need a very, very strong political capacity. You need to be able to make a decision that huge numbers of people all over the world with different languages, different cultural practices, that they'll nonetheless participate in, or at the very least, avoid getting in the way of. To do that, you need some kind of political system, political instrument, which is capable of coordinating people on that basis, is capable of bringing people into the kinds of relationships that lead to or result in this political capacity. Now, a lot of liberals have made the assumption that if you engage in commercial or social relations with people, that this will necessarily over time give you a capacity to do politics with them. It is not obviously the case that that is true. Indeed, international trade often produces over time breakdowns and harsher contradictions in interests. And because there is no political mechanism for resolving those contradictions or differences, or the political mechanisms that do exist are flimsy, what you get is a regression away from the commercial and social relations and into security competition. So, as a consequence of not having a good set of international political institutions, but having nonetheless developed a lot of economic and social relations, engaging in a lot of trade, we've created a situation where there are deep contradictions in the world, deep contradictions of interest. First world countries with different interests from third world countries, developing countries with different interests, China with potentially different interests from the United States, and vice versa, all who have different visions about how to resolve this disagreement, what kinds of institutions or structures would be necessary, what kinds of rules they'd like to have, but no political mechanism for taking a decision on any of these questions. And so what happens is you have repeated attempts to take a political decision. You have rounds of negotiation, multilateral discussions, many, many rounds of this, most of which aren't in the news, most of which people don't talk very much about. But these rounds of discussion don't end up producing decisions. So they don't produce the political capacity that's necessary to manage the intractable disagreement among the parties. People gradually over time become exhausted with a process which isn't fully political, which doesn't actually produce decisions that can then be sustained across time. And so they abandon these mechanisms and return to mechanisms which seem to be capable of taking decisions. But the mechanisms that seem to be capable of taking decisions take decisions that have bearing on much smaller numbers of people. Nation states are able to take decisions, but these decisions coordinate much reduced portions of the global population. So when you go, the international system doesn't work, the international institutions are insufficiently political, let's use the nation state institutions, you exclude the possibility of politically cooperating with people in other nation states with whom you would need other kinds of structures to be able to cooperate. You become restricted politically to the horizon of the nation state, which is territorial, which is limited. And because you're still participating in an international trade system with advanced technology, you're going to find that that nation state is not at all adequate to generating the kinds of decisions you would actually need. But what then happens? What happens when people are in the nation state and thinking that the nation state is going to solve this kind of problem is that they blame other nation states for their behavior. Other nation states are not acting in a way that supports the decision that's being taken in your nation state. Instead, these other nation states are acting in ways that undermine the decision and make it not work. If not for the behavior of this other nation state, your nation state would be able to take this decision effectively and get the result that it's looking for. So, enmity is created on this basis, hostility is created on this basis, and you end up progressing into conflict, war, or Cold War with proxy struggles. That's the kind of logic of going back to the nation state in response to the discontent with the international system. So when we talk about how would we make decisions about this, how would we take decisions about this that would actually change the world in ways that could be sustained across time and make it meaningfully better to generate conditions where people could actually think, act, do things together, workers, ordinary people. To do this, you have to have some kind of structure which is able to grasp this system at that international level. And because nobody has found any kind of base for this, people throw out ideas, they throw out plans and schemes for it that don't tie into the motivation of ordinary people in any way. So you have on the one side a kind of rootless cosmopolitanism that makes normative claims that feel like moral injunction, that don't really go anywhere because they don't actually map onto what motivates people. They're not political in that sense. They're not focusing on what will actually get people to do the activity that I need them to do to bring this thing about. They instead just operate on the level of giving people arguments. Giving people arguments rarely actually gets them to do things. Very rarely, unless you have a structure that makes the decision functional, just telling people you should do this, you should do that. If that works, you don't need a political system. If you can convince somebody to do something, if you can make them agree with you with speech, you don't need politics. You need politics precisely because you can't do that. You nonetheless need these people to cooperate. You have to be able to take decisions that substantial numbers of people don't like to be able to act on an issue like international trade. So the inability to do that puts us in a situation where people are constantly looking to the nation state and then potentially getting embroiled in the kinds of conflicts that generates. And yet at the same time, if I say, well, we need an international political apparatus, I can call for that at the level of making a normative call. It doesn't create the actual commitment. And what the proletarian socialists believed is that you might be able to create a labor movement that was international in scale, such that you not only had solidarity strikes between workers in different industries within the same country, but solidarity strikes across national borders. So steel workers would go on strike, not just in the United States, but also in China. And not just steel workers, but then workers in other sectors would go on strike with the steel workers in both of those places. That was the image. But that kind of solidarity doesn't exist, not just at the level of across borders, in part as a consequence of imperialism and colonialism and the deep divisions and mistrust that's created in the world's people, which manifests as this Eastern or Western socialism, first world or third world Marxism split. That's one of the split. The other split then is the split internal to these particular societies, which we see in the fact that when the Teamsters go on strike in Canada, nobody shows up for them, and then Trudeau's able to crush them, right? Even the sectors that are to do with moving goods and services, logistics, railroads, these are the sectors that seem to have the greatest level still of capacity to effectively organize. What happens when they use the strike power is that no one else shows up for them, and then the government orders them to disband, orders them to disperse and go home. And because they have no support from any other part of society, they acquiesce. Same thing happened with the railroad workers in the States, which Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez voted to crush them in the States. Same kind of thing. There's a total lack of solidarity, even within particular countries, much less across national borders. So the question then is, can that be generated in some other form? Is there some way of creating some solidaristic tie of some kind? This has been very difficult in practice to resolve. I have often taken the view that generating some appearance of organizing success on an issue of some importance to people that would meaningfully change or improve their lives would be an important first step. So something like Medicare for All in the United States would generate a capacity among people to heavily reorganize a sector of the economy that accounts for 17% of US GDP currently. If you could do something like that, that would demonstrate some efficacy in the way in which people are organized and in the way in which people are able to act together. And the thing about healthcare is a doctor cannot treat you from abroad. They can't move the hospital to a foreign country in response to your organizing activity. So it's a sector where there is theoretically more possibility. And this distinction between tradable and non-tradable sectors is, I think, really important and underappreciated. The sectors that can only move with great difficulty and where you can really cost people a lot of money by shutting stuff down. There's a handful of these sectors left, but if you are able to get the society focused on these sectors because they provide important public goods like healthcare, you might be able to get some traction with that. But even that is, a first step that might improve healthcare outcomes, but not ultimately lead anywhere.
There's so much there. Because this brings us in a different direction, a good direction. Because I don't want to black pill people in the good way, because they're already black pilled. But I do want to get to this question of what do we do? Because I think that's the biggest thing. Whenever I have a podcast with you, people love it. But the big thing is damn, I'm so depressed. What do we do? There's a lot of things that you said there that we could zone in on a lot. And it's really tough. But I like that at least brings us in a direction that involves what do we do? Because I think the complaint I often see with pods I do with you, but honestly, in general, pods I do with just in general, I think anybody who's a bit sober, I mean, Varn gets this a lot. Derek Varn gets this complaint. What do we do? And I kind of want to get in that direction. So to go back to what you said about politics involving having to make a decision in the face of an intractable disagreement, aka politics is not the overcoming of contradiction and disagreement, but trying to work through that and still do something. I don't view that as necessarily diametrically opposed to the way I envision politics. I think your view of politics more has to do with the actual basis of political activity, which in some ways is, more important part of the process, in that, one, I assume this means not just at the level of governing, having to actually make a decision, but at the level of organizing, because the organizing involves all this disagreement. So
there's a political aspect to a lot of areas of life. You have these political moments, sometimes even in your family or in very small community organizations, churches, online fandoms. There are these intractable disagreements that come up and a need for a decision because time is pending. I think there's been a general reduction in political capacities in human beings across all sorts of domains. And we can see this in the increasing dysfunction of organizations and the resort to legal rules as a way of trying to get things to happen, appealing to the law because you aren't able to talk it out politically.
And people think sometimes talking out politically has to involve an agreement, or you have to agree to even talk it out. And I see this on different sides of the aisle. And I want to get into this because what I see a practical example of what you mean by politics is that actually changing things involves building coalitions, and building coalitions doesn't involve converting everybody to your side, but actually working with people who you don't agree with. And I feel like that conception of politics is very much baked into one of your proposals, regarding running candidates in different parties, which obviously wouldn't involve having the same ideology manifest in both manifestations of, let's say, I don't know, socialistic candidates in the Democrats or Republicans broadly defined. They would involve different, probably disagreements over a lot of cultural issues, but not a consensus. They would have to agree to disagree on, I don't know, abortion. And Chris Catrone seems to be kind of making a similar argument with his proposal for a socialist party, and that you need to organize workers from both sides of the aisle. You had an interesting conversation with him recently that I saw. But this is what I see as productive, because what I'm sick and tired of hearing is overstating the role of propaganda in changing minds. Because I originally had the same kind of naivete. I came into, that's why I started a YouTube channel in part, was to change minds. And I see a lot of the obsession with the left when it comes to either how to make a movement or to stop the right. It's about changing minds. How do we prevent young men from turning right wing? Well, we need to just go, change their minds with better propaganda. The right's winning because of propaganda. The left needs better propaganda, or we need to.
No, you have to get results.
Right. Results, but also even propaganda. Propaganda to even work has to be based in a reality. It has to be
some degree. Yeah.
To some degree, like it has to be based, it has to speak to people's truths. It doesn't have to be truthful, but it has to speak to a truth. Like, for example, the immigration is one of the most glaring examples of this, I find, and how the left approaches this. Of course, like, a lot of right-wing propaganda on that is exaggerated. It involves all kind of boogeymen stuff, and especially with crime and all that, especially with stuff like that. The left, when it comes to immigration, especially, it's more disastrous in Europe, where the contradictions are much more apparent. There's this kind of attempt to just say, no, like, don't think about it. This is a distraction from the capitalist class, and we need to, this is distracting us from the real class struggle. And this argument doesn't really hold at all. It really can't.
Because if you're not doing anything to improve the situation that is understood by the people that you're dealing with as improving the situation, why should they suspend their areas of disagreement with you and work with you in that area? Why not instead look at who seems to be doing something, which seems to address the problem as they understand it? The difficulty is that a lot of left groups want to prefigure in some way what will be taken to be seen as efficacious by the people they're trying to get involved in their movements. So workers and ordinary citizens in general have their notions of what it would mean to meaningfully help them or meaningfully improve their life. Many of these notions come from living in capitalism. So they're going to involve things that might seem to be making demands on the capitalist state or making demands on corporations to improve behavior or quality of services in various ways. And some Marxists will not be interested in trying to appear efficacious to these people because these people are making demands that these Marxists think are inappropriate or think they shouldn't be making. They'll say instead that you should construct social organizations that meet these needs in some alternative way, and then demonstrate your capacity to meet these needs in some alternative way, and then bring people in on that basis. But in many cases, we're discussing sectors that are heavily corporatized and administered, where there are serious advantages to corporatizing and administering, which is why these sectors came to be structured in this way. Take, for instance, healthcare. In the 1850s, you could have some socialist doctors who provide medicine to people in the community who are socially organized. They wouldn't need access to expensive laboratory equipment. They weren't running terribly expensive tests. And they could provide a quality of service that's probably competitive with the service that people would have to pay for. Now you have this industrialized medicine with all sorts of weird, expensive pharmacological treatments and tests and radiation and chemotherapy and all sorts of very expensive, very complicated, different kinds of treatments. It's very difficult to provide this kind of service to people through ad hoc social organizing. Getting doctors together and having them open up a clinic without money, without large-scale resources, is not going to provide a service that competes in any meaningful way. So social organizing in medicine is not a particularly effective strategy or tactic as a consequence of the way that industry has developed over the years. So what people want is they want access to advanced tests, advanced drugs, advanced expensive stuff, and they want that access affordable to them on the basis that they fulfill their duties and obligations as citizens as they see it. They work, they do what it is that they feel obligated to do. A lot of Marxists view this as making a demand on the capitalist state for welfare. And this came up in my conversation with Chris, where Chris in his piece says that we should, as socialists, strive to defend any right that the workers may express, claim on. But in the discussion with me, Chris says, well, you can't have a right to a commodity or a good, and therefore you can't have a right to things like healthcare or housing or education. In point of fact, the way many people today have come to understand what they would need to live better is something like access to these basic commodities that seem to make up or structure the ordinary Western life. So here you have a very difficult conundrum, because to try to provide for housing or healthcare or education in a social way is challenging to do, especially at scale, especially if you're trying to compete in terms of level of quality. And this is the case even though there are all sorts of problems with the administered technocratic education system. I'm the first to say all sorts of problems with our schools and universities, with the healthcare system and so on. It doesn't mean that social organizing is a straightforward alternative in these areas. Rather, what you might need is a better administered, more efficient system in various regards. What you might need is a system which is regulated or politically organized in such a way, in the case of the university system, that you can have university degrees that aren't immediately connected to some kind of job benefit. Humanities degrees, for instance, that don't have an immediate job skill benefit, but nonetheless, there needs to be some level of funding or support to have research go on in these areas and have people continue to think about these kinds of questions. These are things that it's difficult to do just with social organizing. So in these different areas, what people think constitutes something that benefits them and what many socialists are willing to countenance as really benefiting them, there's a gap. I think in many of these areas, if you want to establish that there is a way of working together that is effective, you would have to organize people around the things that they take to be the things that would really improve their lives. But there's a reluctance to do this because how do you do this without just furthering the obsession with the nation state that people have? How do you do this in a way which doesn't just seem to reinforce the nation state as the horizon of possibility for all activity? And I think that something like healthcare points to some of the limitations of the nation state. You look at the European countries, why is it that the healthcare systems in the European countries have rationing or have long wait times? It's because there's limited physical capacity to support these programs as a consequence of the bond market and what the bond market does to these European states when they attempt to continuously spend beyond the limits which capitalists will tolerate. So I do think that something like the healthcare sector points to the limits of the nation state as a form, even though it is also something that you still have some level of ability to affect from within the constraints of the nation state as a form. And that's the difficult thing. If you go to something which immediately requires an international response, well, the problem is you have no institution or structure for taking a decision on a question of that kind. But if you go to something which can straightforwardly be resolved at the national level or at the local level, then solving that problem seems to suggest that you can get away with not having some sort of international mechanism or supranational mechanism. So what you need is something you can do something meaningful about within the constraints of the national forum, but which, if you want to do it really well, and you want to do it as well as it could be done, will in some obvious way gesture at or direct attention to something supranational or something beyond the national forum. And I think the NHS to some degree performs this function in the UK, but in an insufficient way, because we saw how Brexit could be framed as a way of trying to strengthen the NHS, when, of course, in point of fact, what Brexit did was weaken the NHS by making Britain more dependent on firms, on the financial sector to keep the economy running. And so reduce the ability of the UK to lean on participation in common European rules as a basis for companies to locate in the UK. Indeed, companies that want to operate in English with access to the European market gained an increased incentive to locate in Ireland and to further saturate Ireland with way more corporate money than Ireland possibly knows what to do. These are some of the things I think about. I think the problem is that a lot of stuff, it's attractive because it's something that reinforces a national horizon, or it has an international dimension, but therefore seems like something that can't be done. Ultimately, there has to be some sort of vision for political structures or ways of taking decisions that go beyond the nation state as a form. And so we have to work on stuff which builds people's confidence in their capacity to make decisions, but also helps people to understand the need for something supranational. Is that possible? Is that tractable? I'm not sure. Not now. Maybe in 50 years. I don't know. 100 years. I don't know.
So this is a tricky thing because for any change to happen in a globalized capitalist system, you do need international cooperation. Not necessarily everyone agreeing, but having at least countries be able to come together and operate on a certain set of rules, or at least change conditions in their own respective ways that don't allow for these limitations, like capital mobility and all of the ways in which any kind of national change is so heavily limited. But at the same time, the folly of international politics is it's often homogenizing and therefore unappealing and unworkable at the level of like political vision. So in some sense, I think, like, even if countries are what I believe in is that any politics to work, any political movement, I mean, to first of all, to one, work in a material way and also work in a kind of ideological way. I always see those things as extremely connected. It has to adapt to the local conditions of the region it's in the sense that
Yes.
Socialist movements in America have to adapt to the various different cultural peculiarities and economic peculiarities of the American setting. For example, overly statist conceptions of socialism will never really resonate in America because America, is built on kind of liberal Protestant foundations that make people very hesitant to that kind of thing. What could you use in the American tradition that is more amenable to that? I mean, America has a Republican tradition. Maybe see what's worth salvaging in the Republican tradition. In Canada, for example, we're the least revolutionary country on earth, right? The idea of having a revolutionary politics, people found the trucker petit bourgeois convoy too radical. So let alone any, radical communist revolution. But Canada also has, a right and left wing tradition of social democracy. It has crown corporations. It has things that are workable within it. And that's what I mean. At the level of change, you have to look at your country's particularity. So in a sense, what this means is that there is a nationalist character to political movements. But in terms of political action, they can't be nationalist in the sense of my nation's interest first versus, the outside world, like it's kind of opposed. Because for the changes to actually happen at a national level, require changes in other countries to occur. So how do you square that? Because what I'm trying to say is, when we say that, like, the limits of the nation state, what I see is even more impossible is the kind of workers of the world unite sort of politics. And as we mentioned, not only this not really work even at the height of the workers' movement, in an age where there's no real work, like workers of countries can't unite, workers of provinces and states can't unite.
Right.
Workers can't reunite with each other. So how do you expect workers of the world? So, like, what I mean is we need to find some, like, politics can't be isolationist, but at the same time, like, I want to really encourage people in their different countries to, like, when they do politics, to really pay attention to, like, the culture of the place they live. And I feel like the reason why this is particularly hard for leftists is because a lot of leftists are, rootless cosmopolitans, in the sense that they will have gone to college, they'll sometimes travel different countries, they'll live in places like New York, Chicago, Toronto, places that are heavily, experiencing different cultures. And when you're in this sort of environment, it's really, you can almost lose sight as to what the rest of, you're so, like, multicultural that you forget actually what it means to win over the majority of people in your country, which requires appealing to the particular cultures of that place.
Yeah.
And that is, like, I think, because I, for example, if I was, the reason why I think maybe perhaps it's why Dave is sympathetic to the MAGA communists, not in terms of what they're doing and in terms of, like, their vision of Marxism, Leninism with Jeffersonianism. I think they do a bad job of it. But I'm sympathetic as to the spirit of what they were trying to do is that they at least want to, like, try to make socialism American, or try to, like, appeal to the MAGA base. And I think they do a horrible job of it, but at least that, like, they're trying to, In a lot of left spaces, the very idea of like appealing to the nation state or appealing to national culture is a chauvinist. It's reactionary. It's fascist, even.
It's not so that it's so morally bad. It's that there's a dead end to it. If
That's
it
what you're
doesn't have a
saying, and I
way of
agree, but
translating into a supranational horizon. What people have to realize is the thing that drives people toward nationalism is the sense that the international system is homogenizing everything. Globalization is making everybody the same. People want to be able to make meaningful decisions about how they live and live in different ways from other people in other places. They want different places that they go to be meaningfully different from one another. They want to be able to travel somewhere and have a meaningfully different experience. They want options, real options about where to live, how to live, form of life. You need a supranational system to create a real, genuine possibility of this. If you had, say, a big supranational federation that collected the same level of tax from any business anywhere in the world, wherever it operates, and then gives that tax revenue to a local authority, like a municipality, or in some cases, maybe a small nation state, then that municipality, that nation state, doesn't have to worry that the fact that it's collected this money will drive the business away. Because the business will be subjected to the same tax rate wherever it goes, it's not located there for tax reasons. It's located there because that's a good location for that business to operate in. It's not there because there's a wage benefit to being there. It's not there because there's a regulatory benefit to being there, because the supranational system imposes uniformity with regard to those things to a great degree. The reason to be there then is geographical. It's to do with convenience. The local government or the small nation state could then expend that revenue in any which way to differentiate itself. It could build different buildings. It could create a different kind of university system. It could experiment with different kinds of research or art. It could create jobs in the arts and sciences that otherwise would not exist or make sense or be competitive. And then people around the world would have an opportunity to potentially compete for access to arts and sciences jobs, but in a competition that would have a plurality of different funders with different emphases based on their own local interests, their beliefs about the particular people in the particular cities and communities about what's worthwhile art and science to fund. There are ways of doing this at the level of structure. The issue is, because of the post-Cold War international system, there is no trust in anything like a global or supranational set of institutions. The set of institutions we have that actually exist are so homogenizing that it's occluded from people the reality that the only way you can have global international trade and meaningful differences in the way people live place to place is to have something like international institutions that actually work. And so we might have to get rid of the post-Cold War institutions and endure some period of misery or hardship before people realize that there's a possibility of refounding these structures in such a way that they can actually provide substantively for meaningful difference in the way people live and work in different places in the world. And this is, if this is the case, it's an enormous tragedy, because something like that kind of process is highly likely to result in war, highly likely to result in large amounts of death, and it won't come as the result of a conscious political decision by people. It will come as the result of a kind of inertia as people struggle to make sense of why it is that their lives are being homogenized, why it is that everybody's becoming a cog in one big giant machine. It's a great shame, but the move toward the nationalism, rather than creating the conditions for this supranationalism directly, can only get there indirectly by destroying the post-war system, plunging us into a period of chaos and potential violence, and then maybe at some point emerging from that chaos and violence and making something else. But generally, when you go through a period of chaos and violence, it further entrenches particularity and makes it difficult for people to advocate for something more robustly supranational. A lot of the ideas that people had about creating supranational structures in the 1890s, 1900s, 10s, 20s, and 30s were destroyed as viable or even potentially viable political projects by the world wars, which were themselves also, in another sense, the mechanisms for potentially realizing these projects. World War I both created the opportunity for the Russian Revolution and created deep nationalist attachments that prevented that revolution from being robustly global. It both generated a possibility for someone to attempt a wild supranational project and created the conditions under which that project could not ultimately be fulfilled. And this is the trouble. We seem to get into these situations where the only way that we can move towards supranationalism is to take steps which will ultimately lead us away from it again.
What I sort of mean is, so you're talking about one element of nationalism. I'm trying to talk about both, because what you're talking about the hard real limitation of nationalist politics, which I think one has to be absolutely aware of, because that's the limitation of nationalist politics, both in the left or the right wing variant of it, or even a communist variant, as history showed, But the issue with like internationalism, right, is like when one comes to like, okay, well, it leads people to sometimes think you need to change everything in order for anything to change. And that's the opposite of what you seem to be suggesting at a policy level, which is maybe if you can actually change some things, some major particular things, you can kind of build a certain solidarity around that, like healthcare policy, Medicare for all.
Prove to people they can do something.
Prove to people something can be done. And that's also
something
a way of
real,
like
something that's
enough
to really, really inspire people. Not, what Mamdani's talking about in New York, but something like restructuring a sector that's 17% of US GDP.
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, I do think that's part of why Bernie Sanders focused so much on healthcare, because he thought that, if he was able to push that through, that, even if he didn't get anything else, healthcare would be huge. Even if you got a two-tiered system in the United States, which would be less than satisfactory. I mean, that itself would be pretty massive, just having a public insurance program. This idea of like how to changing something particular and offering concrete solutions, as opposed to this idea of, well, nothing can be done until you change everything. I feel like that attitude lends itself to nihilism far more easily. The kind of, it leads to a lot of pseudo-revolutionary politics. Like you can't change anything unless you change everything.
Yeah, but now we don't even have people who really believe that you can change the healthcare system. That's how sad it is now.
But even changing these things, right? Like particular issues, they require coalitions, power blocks. And that's where I think we have to be very open to like unorthodox sort of class coalitions. Because I think what the new left has relied on are ideological coalitions that don't have a real basis behind them. Like the kind of, I love to use the word popular front of the vulnerable, just because that's what it kind of is. It's, you have the oppressed, but really what it is people who are in the PMC or PMC aspirant students who claim to stand for the oppressed, these blocks of different groups. It's like manifested in Europe most obviously with the kind of like red-green alliances that you see. And that is because if you have a basis of a coalition that's not based on actual shared interest, it's based on like ideological interest, it's very flimsy, and it's very easy to pit people against each other on class, where you have like the bourgeois factions of like a racial minority have different interests. And so what is actually a class interest coalition? If you can't get like the workers, like in the old days, to hold the economy hostage, to be able to have economic leverage to push for changes, what are the new coalitions? And that's something I'm very interested in. One idea I've had for Canada in particular is because in Canada, I believe the primary contradiction in the economy, at least as far as class goes, is between renters and those who collect rent and those who pay it, essentially, more than actually labor and capital, in the sense that, real estate is a massive part of our economy. In fact, housing is far less affordable in Canada than is in the United States. This surprises people. Canada is supposed to be more socialistic. It does have a better welfare state, but it's actually, inequality is getting insane and the standard of living is declining. And you have a kind of real estate economy that's totally, in a certain sense, like it does look like neo-feudalism. I don't buy the neo-feudal thesis so much because I think capitalism already was neo-feudalism, in the sense that capitalism is the proletarianization of the petite bourgeoisie, of the middling sort. And kind of what is happening now is a further extension of that, where basically, like, people can't own anything. Even the dream of home ownership is very non-existent. And what you have is, I think, a common class coalition that could form, but it's not forming due to that kind of ideology, the really stark ideological divides that you see, is between people who, are working class and people who might be small business owners, but they have to pay a large percentage of their income on rents. So, to landlord, but also to lease land. Small businesses really struggle with that, having to pay tons of money just for land. They also often rent. They don't always own their homes. But there's a kind of common class interest against the sort of rentist capitalists, the rentists who get rich off of collecting rent. And it's also something I think you can actually do something about. You alluded to this in your first book when you talked about, like, one of the only things where local governments have power over is land laws.
Yeah, land use.
And it's not something where capital flight is so easily an obstacle, because it's land, right? And I thought about this too, looking at this book called The Economic Foundations of Democracy or something, but it's basically like countries are more likely to democratize when they have class divisions if the economy is less based on a basically like rent extraction, as opposed to capital. Because if you have like a class that is their wealth is based in physical capital, physical land, a government that could be democratically elected by the people could do something to threaten that wealth. Whereas when you have capital mobility, it's a lot easier for them to get around that.
And Are you thinking about the old Carl Boyce book from 2003?
It's called The Economic. I think one of the authors was in the book of How Nations Get Rich. How nations
fail.
Yeah, one of the same authors is in that book. I can't pronounce her name. That's why. It's just very.
Yeah. There's this old Boyce book, Democracy and Redistribution, that makes something like this argument that socialism is more likely to happen in places where the wealth is tied to minerals or land. But of course, for that reason, socialism is less likely to happen because it's more likely to happen in places that are less developed.
Mm-hmm. So regardless of the name we're going to use, like socialism, I mean like actually a movement being able to do something that demonstrates that it can deliver a result on something. And housing is like the chief concern in Canada. And I do see that as something to build a lot of solidarity around. In America, healthcare perhaps is a big one, just because, like, being the most wealthy country in the world that without access to affordable healthcare is pretty big failing. I mean, that's a pretty serious concern. Now, the issue, though, is that the way we think of things ideologically is that right now the petite bourgeoisie tends to gravitate to conservative views, conservative politicians, and leftists tend to tail liberal views socially and economically, and I think that's a serious problem, and that's why I hate when people say the PMC and the petite bourgeoisie are the same. They're not. They're obviously not. Like, in that the professional managerial class is much more what I see kind of the left is more made up of that. There's variants of that on the right, but the right-wing parties, electoral base, they tend to win over the small business owners more in Canada, at least. And actually, increasingly, the working class.
Yeah.
But because the left wants to say, the problem is you can't win over people who are reactionary without appealing to reactionary ideas, and then you're reactionary if you're doing that. But at the same time, it ends up tailing liberalism and continually losing these people. And it's prioritizing essentially ideological purity left as this attachment to progress, as opposed to like a real practical basis for a coalition that could get something done. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at really here is there's a big discontinuity between what could be the basis of coalition building, a new coalition, which, I'm alluding to essentially a petit bourgeois working class alliance with parts of the PMC. I mean, everyone likes to pretend that they're against these things, but in practice, a movement requires some element of that. But I mean, out the gate, being willing to work through that. And then the ideology, which is like this attachment to like, if you, for example, don't want to prioritize the latest trans issue or the latest whatever issue, you're throwing people under the bus, or see what I mean exactly? And there's the basis. We need to find a new coalition that's based on actual shared interest, a shared interest. And then there's a lot of ideological obstacles that are blocking us from ever even thinking of that.
Yeah, in recent years, I've found myself circling back to healthcare again because housing runs up against a few different issues. One is the aging population problem in the Western countries means you have a large number of older voters who own their homes and who view their homes as an important part of their retirement. Especially because of the decline of the defined benefit pensions, there's a reliance of a lot of homeowners on their house as their source of retirement insurance in extremis. And leading in some cases to things like reverse mortgages or people selling their homes to pay for moving into a care home or something like that. Yeah.
Well, that is true, but in practice, actually, a lot of people don't sell their homes. Actually, majority don't see of the old population, at least in Canada, from what I've looked at, don't just because the property tax is involved. And also because there's no one to sell them to.
Yeah. So there's a lot of reverse mortgaging that has become more common. And then, some instances of downsizing in places where that's doable. The other thing that goes on that makes housing challenging is the way in which housing construction is connected to the imbalances that pervade the global trade system as a whole. So part of why it's so expensive to construct homes in North America is the imbalance between production and consumption between the United States and China. There's all of this construction that goes on in China very cheap to the point where you have all of these unnecessary empty buildings. But in the United States or in Canada, where there's enormous demand for construction, it's too expensive to build very much, very fast. And there's a kind of pattern of imbalance here that in both cases, I think both countries would benefit from a deal that would rectify that to some degree. China should build fewer buildings. It should become a little bit more expensive to build buildings in China. And there should be more raw material, housing material operation in the United States. It should become cheaper. There should be more housing materials built and developed in the United States to lower the construction costs for American housing. But to get that to happen, you would need some sort of agreement between the United States and China to gently rebalance the trade relationship. Or you would need the United States to force the trade relationship to change over time through a process of decoupling. So there is, I think, a lot of international trade at play in the housing market question. And then also, one of the major factors in recent years has been the high interest rates that the central banks have been running, which has made it much, much more expensive in terms of interest to buy a house. And that's something that could change. We might see a return to something like the post-2008 economy, which, if that were to happen, would mean that there would be a lowering of interest rates and therefore some reduction in the severity of the problem from the point of view of interest rates. But these are a couple of the things that I do have some concerns about. Of course, in cases where there is land available for development, I think that local communities have some scope here, and there are some things you can do locally, especially if you're talking about a stage of a movement where you are not to a point where you can try to do something about healthcare, but you can do some things because you have some level of presence in local structures. You might be able there to focus on land use in cases where you have undeveloped land. Trying to do this, though, in major cities is a much harder thing to do. Much harder, in part because a lot of the investment that's flowing through those cities is coming through the real estate market. A place like New York City, there's a ton of foreign capital that is in the housing market in New York City or in Vancouver or in Toronto. And so it's more disruptive to capital to try to do these things in these heavily built up dense cities. And also these cities are committed to a kind of infrastructure that suits the kind of construction that currently exists. So if you were to, in Los Angeles or San Francisco, do the Abundance Boys thing and build big towering skyscrapers with great density of residential housing, the question then would be, how are people in California supposed to get around? Because the roads in California are already overcrowded. And the state government in California struggles to raise the funds to build any kind of newfangled transportation infrastructure. And it faces opposition when it tries to build that infrastructure from all the people that would have their lives disrupted in some way by its construction. And you've got a federal government that is not at all interested in helping California build a bunch of infrastructure to support building high-rise developments, in part because the federal government knows that there's been an overconcentration of economic development in the 20 largest municipalities in the United States and an underdevelopment of other regions of the country. So to dump even more money into infrastructure in California will heighten regional imbalances. So these are a few of the things that I do think are issues with housing as the primary focus. But I do think that particularly in cases where you are operating in a rural area or a suburban area, maybe in a low population US state or Canadian province, where a lot of stuff hasn't been built yet, could theoretically be built on land that has not yet been taken up and used for a particular purpose, where infrastructure hasn't yet been built and therefore could be built along the lines of many different plans that people might have, then you have a little bit more control and a possibility of getting somewhere.
I mean, that makes sense for the US context. In Canada, for one, so Canada, we have a tradition of the crown corporations, which, so it's not unusual for in Canada, the federal government to be able to step in with these big crown corporations that have huge capacities to be able to provide immense investment and to build up housing. And in fact, it's kind of what we did in the post-war era. In the post-war era, Canada had the biggest surge of immigration ever. And it's actually something the kind of nationalist faction that's very small complains about. I always say, something like 1962 is when the day Canada died or whatever. But actually housing costs didn't go up at this time because the state had such huge capacity to be able to build so much housing in the post-war era. I mean, there was a sort of light democratic consensus. It wasn't quite what you had in the Nordic countries or anything. It was certainly more than in America. Now it's very different. Since the 90s, what happened is the federal government offloaded funding for housing to the provincial and municipal governments, which severely
made them more like
restricted
American states
capacities. And when you had a surge of immigration since 2015, Canada had one of its biggest surges of immigration ever. You saw a huge rise in housing. And as a result, the only solution the right can think of, less immigrants, and maybe in some cases actually Poilievre supports a lot of the Ezra Klein kind of policies, like deregulation to free up some land and stuff, to not be so precious about environmental restrictions and whatever. Now, obviously, Carney, as our current prime minister, reduced the amount of immigration because it was way much than we've ever experienced. However, it's not a bring back the crown corporations. They're at the federal level. In fact, there has been proposals for that. It's the big issue, and we have the capacity too in Canada to get things done like this, just due to the amount of power the executive has. Especially if you have a majority in Parliament, they have immense power, more than the U.S. There's a couple huge obstacles to this, which is the fact that real estate exerts like a huge dominance over our politics. Like a massive, just at the level of even the government, being owners of multiple properties, highly invested in real estate, causing like a huge conflict of interest there. And you have like housing ministers who have like multiple properties. They don't want to see their properties go down. And you mentioned like trying to, maybe you could make the problem better with like lowering interest rates. But the thing is, in Canada, that's what caused the problem. That's part of what caused the problem. Like we had very low interest rates during COVID. It actually inflated the housing prices, because what it allowed is people who already have a lot of money to borrow more money and buy a bunch of properties they don't actually need. And you had the prices go up. And in fact, we're such an open arena that Chinese billionaires love to use Canada as a playground, to like buy properties that are vacant and just,
some of this
like
is
buy and sell them. Like
economic model of Canada
casino
is to be in many sectors a friendlier or looser model than the United States. So immigration rules are looser in Canada than in the United States. It's easier for foreign capital maybe to come into Canada in some cases than the United States. So some of these rules are written to give Canada what advantages it can get, given its proximity to the United States, but technically not having the same legal jurisdiction. In these respects, Canada is a little bit like Ireland relative to the UK.
A little bit. But it's a dependence on capital that doesn't translate. Like in real estate being a part of our economy doesn't translate to growth that is felt by people. In fact,
Ireland,
it's like translates to growth
very
that is
similar.
hurting. Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think that's an issue where you could actually do something, in the sense that there is still in Canada, for all of the monopolization that's occurred, a large percentage of businesses are small business owners. They have a huge amount of power. I mean, as the convoy showed, why I found that to be a very interesting event is that the trucker convoy kind of was doing stuff that like labor strike, like that, the railway strikers would do back in the day. They were exerting real power. And the fact that the left kind of they like rejected so much that convoy, just because a lot of the convoy was obsessed with like
the left
vaccine
in
mandates.
Canada, what did they do for the Teamsters when the Canadian Teamsters went on strike? It didn't seem like they did very much even for them.
No. Well, they do support the Teamsters. The recent Air Canada strikes. They did support that, but the thing is, the leverage wasn't as strong there. There was,
the Canadian
so that
left
really
seems pretty weak.
much.
If,
you need to like have power blocks. Very
couldn't
weak,
do anything for those
extremely
Teamsters.
Weak, which is why like the Canadian left has either tried to stick to like this idea of just like, we'll try this time to organize the workers, we'll try this time, or what it does is pivots to like other groups, to indigenous
the
people.
Farmer labor movement from back in the 30s, the willingness to use the farmers.
Well, that worked. That worked because that was an alliance
there was
between
more
farmers
agricultural
and
workers,
right?
And this is such a common theme in early 20th century socialism. The large number of agricultural workers is a constituency that consistently was one that people could potentially ally with or work with. That constituency has not been replaced. There's no other obvious constituency that takes the place of the agricultural laborers.
Well, there has. It just hasn't been very good. Like, I mean, the PMC labor constituency.
And there's stuff that's been floated as a possibility, but
perhaps
nothing that has been proven to effectively operate. And nobody's proven an ability to have the old traditional working class be in alliance with the professionals for any length of time to any significant effect.
Yes, and in fact, that's kind of why workers have all flocked to the right.
And that's why the left has become
so many
frustrated
places
with the workers. The left has been unable, in many contexts, to keep that kind of cooperation going. And then when it's unable to sustain that cooperation, it blames the workers for this.
So what I'm trying to allude to here is like, obviously there needs to be a power block that's behind a political movement, or else it's not standing on anything. So what do you think that power block could look class
I think that we might be in a period, I like
alliances?
to call it middle capitalism, in which we have a slowdown in the transformation that many new leftists identified in the post-war era. A slowdown in the shift from heavy labor-intensive manufacturing to highly educated knowledge workers. This shift that was supposed to completely transform the Western rich liberal democracies both happened and didn't happen. It happened in this partial, incomplete way, producing a society that is fractured, that is caught between two worlds, a world which still seems to be in some way connected to the early 20th century world in which proletarian socialism had viability, a world which has not yet fully emerged, but which many people are impatient for and keep demanding. And a lot of the futurism, a lot of the obsession with the tech sector in our society among the left crowd is connected with this desire for late capitalism to emerge, for what was described as late capitalism to actually come into existence. It has never fully come into existence. And so there are these kind of two different lefts, each of which calls the other a right, that belong to two different worlds, one of which is fading and the other of which has not yet come. And so then we're stuck in this middle capitalist space. And the question is, how do you organize in middle capitalism? Do you organize in the early capitalist way or in the late capitalist way? And the answer is, well, neither of those are adequate to middle capitalism. All that middle capitalism seems to be adequate for is gradually moving maybe toward one or the other. And so then you get into a demographic long-term battle where people are waiting for the society to change. They're waiting either for the professional, university-educated, administered people to go away and become proletarianized, or they're waiting for the old working-class proletariat to go to college and become professional. And I think that's where most people in the contemporary left are, waiting for one of these things to happen, asserting that there's a demographic destiny that will be brought about by the production of a certain kind of subjectivity. And in the meantime, things get worse for people and nothing is really done.
But the way when I think of like these kind of potential coalitions, I don't think of it like in an immediate sense. Like, what do we do now? In fact, I think the conditions are so poor now that, even if the conditions were right, there wouldn't be any left there to like fill the gap, to actually be up for the task, to take power democratically or some kind of revolution or whatever. It's, which is why I think when you have these kind of changes, the best one can do is analyze them and try to form a political groups that can adapt this environment and also get ahead of it, both economically and ideologically. So like economically, in this sort of sense of like needing a coalition that's beyond just the working class. Because let's be honest, most communists and socialist groups who claim, even the hardest communist ones, who claim to be for the working class, it's really students who are working class, which constitute a different subjectivity. So it's like, even then, it's like, let's be honest, guys, nobody's really like doing this. What is an actual coalition that doesn't involve selling out to the ruling class, like, or to the big bourgeoisie completely, right? Because that's kind of what happens, is like a lot of these left governments come to power with an agenda, but then they find themselves having to like compromise with a part of capital. They have to bend to big capital. And it's like, okay, if you don't believe in that, you need a power block somewhere else. And where is that? Because I don't see one right now. And I'm trying to at least look at like, who are the people who have power and who might have mutual
the military
interests.
Is another important,
because it's like, I believe
in that. You have to have a military that is willing to at least tolerate the decisions that you take. And in extremis, you need the military to back up the decisions that you take. And one thing the left has hated doing for quite a while now is considering the possibility that it might need the military on side, and therefore it has to behave in such a way that people who are in the military might support it or at least tolerate it with some reluctance. And that has come up again and again, and it comes up not just in politics, but in fiction. I remember the British miniseries, A Very British Coup from the early 80s, about what would happen if Britain attempted to take a financial bailout from the Soviet Union instead of going to the IMF. And of course, what they imagine is that there would be a military coup in the UK on that basis. If you don't get the military, you end up having all kinds of problems ultimately. A lot of this stuff has focused too much on trying to get control of national institutions and assuming that once you get national institutions, you'll be okay. Especially in the United States, there's a lot of this thinking because of how big the United States is. People think if they could get control of the United States, that they could just have their way with the world. And it's just not true. You could do things. The United States can do a lot of things more than most places, but you can't simply make the world work whatever way you want as the US president. And there's some fantasizing about it.
Or at least you could do stuff without
you
your
could break
economy
things.
destroyed.
You could do the Nixon
small
shit.
state.
You could break stuff. You could break Bretton Woods and get away with it. US presidents break international rules and systems sometimes and get away with it. But usually when they break these things, they're never able to replace what they've broken. Since Bush violated all the UN rules to go into Iraq, the UN has never been taken as seriously. And it never will be taken as seriously again. Once you break the rules, once you destroy the credibility of the structure, it doesn't quite have the same pull anymore. And insofar as it works, it becomes evident that it only works for those countries that are too weak to be able to resist it. Only those countries that are subject to it because they're not strong enough to be able to ignore it. And so it causes it to begin to appear as an imperial or colonial project. And once people start thinking in this way, in terms of imperialism or colonialism, it makes it so difficult for any kind of supranational solidarity to take root. The whole thinking in terms of colonialism and internationalism and imperialism and settlers versus indigenous, population groups, this way of thinking makes it very, very difficult in practice for people to feel cross-border solidarity.
Yeah, that's kind of where you have the left mirroring the decay of the right with sort of what I'll say is a mutual anti-civilizational politics. Now, that's kind of loaded term, But what I mean by anti-civilizational tendencies is like a kind of tendency towards balkanization, essentially, of the polity. And I think a lot of the far right's politics is headed in this direction, even though it might claim to be nationalist. I think in practice leads to this sort of tendency there's aspects of the left that have this with the kind of, Americanism, this kind of, maybe if the U.S. empire just falls, the world will be able to be free, right? This kind of fantasy. Also like this reluctance to even work within any of the institutions and what have you. But I mean, like, we're far from even the point where like a left is like competent enough to even work with institutions, like outside of the university and stuff like cultural institutions. But at the level of the military, already, like, even though I actually think the possibility of getting a lot of people in the military to be at least tolerate a social democratic project even is far more likely than even like getting police to be, left-wing and socialist, even though I think the left is way too anti-cop in the sense that its rhetoric around police is really childish and self-times. But it doesn't mean it has to go fash mode either. But obviously, goes without saying. But sometimes you have to really preface these things for these people. But with the military, one thing that I've noticed in American history and also like the tendencies as where things are going is like the right is kind of more shifting towards like this kind of balkanization politics where what I predict is going to happen is this an extension of kind of what's already happening is like, people thought that Trump's failures, if Trump was elected, it'll lead more people to go to the left. What I see actually happening is people are going to an even further right. People are gravitating to the white nationalists at an alarming rate. And in America, the closest thing you had to like fascism, the far right anyway, was anti-nationalist in practice. Like it was the Confederacy, right? The Confederacy was secessionist. And you had the KKK, which is also wants to create white-only zones. It's the right now who's kind of having this sort of extreme anti-civilizational politics that I think is very anti-American. Zizek has recently made the case that the left should position itself as, left, socialists, whatever, what have you, should position themselves as the forces of order as opposed to the forces of chaos. But the problem is the left is still so tied to like a new left identity, which is based around subversion. It's identified by what it is not. It's identified by subverting, norms. But like when you have a right that is kind of, I think, actually pulling the U.S. to sort of more secessionist direction, right? The Civil War, ever since Donald Trump, the talks about Civil War have been far more. And I mean, you have it kind of being mirrored on other sides. Maybe it'll be good if California separates, because in the progressive, we won't have
secessionism.
I do take it seriously because I actually think there is a.
It's already been proven on a military level that it cannot be done, even with rickety old 1860s rifles that anybody can get their hands on. You can't beat the federal army, let alone with what they've got now.
Oh, I'm not saying it's going to work. I'm not saying a civil war would be. What I'm trying to say is that the kind of move to that could happen and has happened. And that doesn't mean that the people who try to resist are going to win. But what I mean is right now you kind of have the sort of anti-civilizational groups are the far right. And it would be better if you had a position that could actually be more solidaristic, like an opposition to that was more solidaristic rather than mirroring these aspects. What I see is like a left that tends to mirror aspects of the far right, I mean, that might get into the Charlie Kirk discussion later, or soon, because I do see, it's really hard to articulate. But what I more mean is I think in the United States, you actually really have an opening to claim a sort of patriotism that is not so anti-solidaristic, that isn't zero sum. And that doesn't have to be so deeply nihilistic, because what I think the problem with the right is deeply nihilistic and kind of, it hates kind of the liberal culture takeover, the migrants takeover that it perceives, the white genocide, whatever. And it is moving increasingly towards a politics that it wants to be more homogenizing, but due to the diversity of the United States, that can only really lead to balkanization.
But because of the power of the American state, you can't actually do that. So it just becomes a LARP. It becomes just as confused as the, ML tanky LARPing that goes on in many spaces.
No, but except that it's a LARP, but it's something that has potential power around it in the sense that I think there are a lot of capitalists, I think there are more capitalists who would support the far right than the far left. I think there are capitalists out there, rich people who genuinely might believe in a white supremacist project, might help.
But it's been demonstrated that
there's also
the federal
local
military will not permit this to happen and will kill hundreds of thousands of people to make sure that it doesn't occur. So it's not going to happen. There's a military state reality to what the United States is. And the level of federal military capability versus what state governors can potentially call up. There's no, back in the old days, you could call upon the people of your state to come, and they would have their own rifles in many cases already. And their rifles would be just as good as those of the Union soldiers. It was a whole different kind of proposition.
Yeah, but you get what I'm trying to say with this. It's not that like, oh, we're on the verge of America splitting apart. What I'm saying is that you have this kind of move on the far right, and the left doesn't seize any opportunity to even like want to, be the force of more
Well, in
unity,
practice, it
more
becomes
order.
associated with the liberal
You know,
international
and
system, and the liberal international system seems to be the force of homogenization. Seems to be the thing which is subordinating the American interest to this set of allied states or other states. So a lot of the, if you make an argument for order, what that cashes out in oftentimes is a commitment to the post-war liberal institutions, which are felt as constraining. So, I think Zizek, in talking about a European case, the Europeans are.
he was talking about Trump. He was talking about Trump in a particular talk that I was listening to.
I think he's projecting some of his
so
arguments
like,
about Europe
by being a force for order doesn't mean
context. Because in the European case, the Europeans are leading the MPIA, so they are positioning themselves as the defenders of the rules-based order.
No, but that's not what I'm saying, and that's not he wasn't saying, and I'm not saying like the force for order as in the force for the status quo. I mean for a force of order in the sense of not, because the people who want change that is disastrous, that can lead to worse outcomes. And it's not like this typical position of like, we shouldn't change anything, but rather changes that actually can like reduce the violence, reduce the chaos. That's kind of what I mean, like, as opposed to like, defending the status quo. Whereas what I think is unhelpful is this phantasmatic position of like praying that the US accelerates to chaos somehow and that will lead to revolution. Whereas like you mentioned that, you wouldn't even think the far right would stand a chance against the military. I mean, imagine the far left would stand even less of a chance.
There's no civil war in the United States.
Well, actually, no, I wouldn't rule that out. I think it could happen.
I would rule that out
end well.
Any duration of time that is relevant to us today. I would rule it out completely. I would not entertain it in any kind of serious way, because the things that Americans really care about are going to the grocery store and the pizza in the grocery store being reasonably priced, and the specific brand, the specific type of pizza in the grocery store you're accustomed to buying, your favorite pizza brand. It has to be there, and it has to be perfect, and it has to be at that price. And if you disrupt, if you create inflation, if you disrupt commerce, if you muck around with prices of things, there's a political cost. The most likely negative outcome for the right in the next couple of years in the United States is that they over tariff. There's a kick up in prices of stuff at grocery stores, and then they get wiped in the midterms on the basis of that. That's the most likely negative outcome for the right in the next 2 to 5 years, is that they overplay their hand in the trade war,
which
and
could
lose the House.
Yeah, but the most extreme actions aren't perpetuated by the, common sense majority American. It's by people who are very ideologically
but the military knows
invested.
Where its bread is buttered in the States. You have to get legitimacy, from the broad sections of the American public, not the loud, crazy people on the internet who say all kinds of cockamamie things. And
of course, but this is my point precisely, is that's why I think the left should be more willing to work with these institutions. Whereas, especially in the face of an increasingly radicalized right that, is embracing a sort of politics that is actually, I think, far more anarchic.
What would that look like, the left working with these institutions? What do you mean concretely?
So what I mean, first of all, is like it needs to anyway have a basis of a fraction of the military that at least enough of the military that at least won't want to shoot down, the project, like who won't want to actually get in the way, and let alone, support it. It needs that to happen anyway. Right now, you have this kind of view that like where it's like there's some people who really believe if you are a veteran, that you are a fundamental
Yeah, that
evil
also doesn't
person,
sync with the numbers that we have in
and
terms
that
of the political attitudes of veterans or of active duty troops or of officers, which shows, especially with
yes.
officers, if anything, a Democratic Party skew.
Well, a lot of the personnel of a lot of the reserves in the military are blacks and Latinos. It's increasingly it's something actually the right complains that it's no longer white. But like my point here is that you would think that in such conditions that people who are left of center wouldn't be so hostile kind of working within. So like I'll give you an example. I have a friend of mine named Harper O'Connor, who's from Kansas, left YouTuber. He proposed this. He made a video proposing like using the military to deal with climate change. He proposed the idea of like the climate corps, and he drew on kind of some of Frederick Jameson's ideas about being a way to.
Biden proposed something
I won't
along
get
these
into it all here
lines
without
as
getting
part of the
redundant.
big, beautiful bill. It didn't ultimately make it through. Civilian Climate Corps as a kind of pseudo-military climate-related body.
Look, now, regardless of what do you think about realistic, but like I think that is a viable way to deal with climate change. One of the one of the viable ways. But like a lot of left was, very opposed to that even because it's like, oh, you're boosting the military industrial complex.
The right made fun of it a lot.
They
They treated it as a kind of fake jobs program for college graduates.
Sure. I mean, what I'm saying is like in terms of realistic solutions, you're either going to need to work with parts of them, and even if you don't believe in working with the institutions, even if you're not a reformist, even if you believe in this idea of revolution, which I'm not talking to you here. That's the thing. Remember, I'm addressing a lot of lefties here. Even if you believe in like totally transforming, that would entail getting, you can't have the military be completely willing to just shoot you down. Even if you had a democratically elected government, you can't have the military be able to completely shoot people. Like, that's what I mean. And the reason I brought up the right and its kind of extremist tendency that it's going in as an opening for the left. And in fact, I thought it was interesting that in the move Civil War, which I know you critiqued, but what I thought was interesting in it is like the people who are pretty much perpetrating really the Civil War are the far right. And it's kind of really like this liberal coalition that's fighting against it. And then, it was like this liberal coalition. But there's something about this that reflects in the zeitgeist as to like who is more likely to perpetuate the forces of disorder. It's the far right. And I think left politics can use that as an opportunity, And what I see right now is a kind of what permeates a lot of the left is this sort of big resistance against anything like that. Not just forget the military. Cops are bad, right?
Oh yeah, I don't think that there should be hostility.
It's this very self-marginalizing,
alienating the military and the police doesn't make sense. At the same time, I wouldn't want people to be spreading intense fear narratives about other people in the country, feeding into some kind of narrative that other people in the country pose some kind of terrible, imminent threat to them, because this isn't really true. None of these groups in the country are well organized or have the ability to contest state power. So I wouldn't want to fearmonger and incite any kind of worry on the part of parts of the population about other groups. Certainly not racial, ethnic, religious, anything like that.
Oh, of course. Yeah, well, I'm very adamantly, I'm for doing whatever we can to actually prevent race wars, which you might not think are a threat. I think race wars are a threat, but I don't want to say that like they're like happening. But I mean, I think actually that's where the head
There's
is, if I'm
too
being
much,
honest.
people, the internet
And
at this point and the algorithms on the internet are operating in a way that greatly exaggerates the amount of lunatic energy that is out there in the country. And so there has to be great care, especially with the changes to the Twitter algorithm that have been brought in over the last few years, and the Instagram algorithm as well, which those are different changes, but which have had a similar effect. In the last week, there's video footage of murders circulating on Instagram and on Twitter that just anybody can see, and no effort to restrict access to this stuff, no effort at all to prevent people from seeing these videos. There is a lot of content floating around on the internet that does not really reflect the day-to-day reality of American life, but produces, I think, especially in people who are not living in the United States, a perception of the level of internal conflict and the level of hostility that people have that is greater than what you would really experience, especially if you were to go outside of a major city into a red state and you hang around with people who vote for Trump or like Trump. What you see is that they do not correspond with the online image of the white supremacist who's found now.
of course, so what I'm saying is not, I'm against, playing into the, the fear mongering of the other side, in the sense of it's hard to articulate what I'm saying because I feel like this kind of misses what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that there are those on the far right who are extremist voices, not like when I say the far right and the extremist force, I don't mean all Trump supporters. There are forces on the far right who, do advocate for extreme things, and you have people who might, on the far left, cheer on assassinations of right-wing figures, as we've been seeing. Okay, and in response to that, I do fear, you have these reactions where it's like, okay, the left is the side of murder, the right is the side of murder. What I'm kind of saying is not that we should say one side is the side of murder, but rather that we should be, trying to have a more politics that is open to solidarity with people across political lines. Hence why I'm for a class politics, but one that isn't terribly outdated and myopically only being, centering around the proletariat as the revolutionary actor. I think you need class politics that's based on common interests, which is a way you can get around, which is where you can still have a politics where people agree to disagree on other things. Okay, well, all this brings us to the discussion of Charlie Kirk's, the trajectory the United States is headed in. You have some sobering takes on this matter, as usual. We're going to discuss all of that in the back room on Patreon, which you get access to. And you get access to, at this point, over 74, 75 exclusive episodes. It's a good way to support the channel. In fact, the only way, really, all my work really stays afloat. In fact, every time I upload a big YouTube video on the big channel, I can put so much effort into it. I get maybe 10, 12 patrons after many, many months of effort. Well, at least you can join a nice Discord and get access to a whole set of episodes the rest of the people won't hear. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. Hope to see you there.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.